The night had settled in with an oppressive stillness, the kind that seemed to wrap itself around the house, making even the smallest sounds feel amplified. John Carson sat alone in his living room, the glow of his computer screen the only source of light. He had been working late on an article, trying to finish a project that had been eating at him for days. His eyes were tired, his body slumped in the chair as the clock on the wall ticked relentlessly towards midnight. The room was silent except for the occasional hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. The house, though quaint and old, had always felt safe to John. It was a place he could retreat to after a long day of work, a small sanctuary where he could leave the world behind. But tonight, as the wind howled outside, he couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that crept up his spine, like there was something wrong, something lurking just beyond his awareness. He brushed it off as fatigue, convincing himself that it was just his overactive imagination working overtime. As he clicked through a few more lines on his screen, his phone buzzed on the table beside him. He reached over, glanced at the screen, and froze. It was a call from his own number. For a split second, John considered ignoring it. It could be some strange glitch, a random error in the system. But something about the situation felt different, off somehow. He picked up the phone, his fingers trembling slightly as he swiped it to answer. The moment he held it to his ear, an eerie silence enveloped the room. Then, a voice came through the speaker. It was his voice, but distorted as if something was wrong with it, distant, strained, and unnatural. "Don't open the door," the voice said. John's heart skipped a beat. His breath caught in his throat as he instinctively glanced toward the front door, which was just visible from where he sat. It stood there, unassuming, normal even, but something about it felt different now. The voice on the phone, his own voice, carried an urgency that made his skin crawl. He couldn't explain why, but a chill ran down his spine, and a knot formed in his stomach. The voice continued, more insistent this time. "Don't open the door." John's hand tightened around the phone, his thoughts racing. How could this be happening? How was it possible for someone to call him from his own number? And more importantly, who was on the other end of the line? Was this some kind of prank? He couldn't shake the feeling that this was no ordinary call, no random glitch in the system. His mind raced with possibilities, but the most chilling thought gnawed at the edges of his consciousness. What if the voice was warning him about something real, something tangible, something standing outside his door, waiting? Before he could gather his thoughts, the voice suddenly cut off, replaced by a series of clicks. The line went dead. John sat frozen for a moment, the phone still pressed against his ear. He could hear nothing but the faint, distant hum of the line. He lowered the phone, staring at the screen, half expecting the number to flash again. But there was nothing. The call had ended. His hand shook as he placed the phone down on the table, the eerie message lingering in his mind. He stood up slowly, walking to the window. The house was set back from the street, nestled in the woods, far enough from neighbors that he rarely felt disturbed. The streetlights outside cast long shadows across the yard, their dim glow flickering with each gust of wind. Everything appeared normal, yet his heart raced in his chest as he stared into the darkness, as if something was out there, something waiting for him to make the wrong move. He turned back to the door. It was a simple wooden door, with a brass doorknob that glinted faintly in the low light. But now, as he stood before it, it felt menacing, like the threshold to something unknown, something terrifying. His instincts screamed at him not to open it, to turn away, to hide. But curiosity tugged at him, urging him to find out what or who was out there. He took a step toward it, his hand reaching out to grasp the doorknob. But just as his fingers brushed the cold metal, there was a sound that stopped him dead in his tracks. A soft, hesitant knock, barely audible against the silence of the house. 3 taps. Slow, deliberate. John's breath hitched. He stepped back, his pulse racing in his ears. For a moment, he was frozen, unable to move, his mind in chaos. The knock came again, louder this time, as if the person on the other side of the door was growing impatient. 3 more knocks, each one a steady reminder that something or someone was waiting outside. The room felt colder now, the air thick with tension. John's body was rigid, caught between the urge to run and the nagging curiosity that kept him rooted in place. He wanted to ignore it, to pretend that the knock had never happened. But the voice from the phone, kept repeating in his mind, "Don't open the door." It was as if the words were burned into his brain, refusing to fade. But the knocking didn't stop. It continued, more insistent, louder now, echoing through the house. John could feel his heart pounding in his chest as he approached the door again, this time more cautiously. He knew he shouldn't open it. He knew it was a bad idea. But what if it was someone he knew? Someone who needed help? What if the voice on the phone was wrong, just a strange coincidence? He reached for the doorknob again, his fingers trembling. The knocking paused for a moment, and he could have sworn he heard breathing on the other side. Soft, steady, but unmistakable. His throat went dry, and he hesitated. Should he call the police? Should he run? The fear gripped him tightly, making it hard to think clearly. Just as he was about to pull away from the door, the knocking came again. But this time it was different. It was louder, harder, as if someone was pounding on the door with frantic desperation. John's heart skipped a beat. Something was wrong. With a trembling hand, he slowly turned the doorknob and pulled the door open, just a crack. The darkness outside greeted him, the only sound the rustling of the wind through the trees. His eyes scanned the porch, but there was no one in sight. He stepped outside cautiously, his gaze sweeping across the yard, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The air was still, cold and unsettlingly empty. There was no sign of anyone, no one hiding in the shadows, no footprints in the dirt. But then, as he stood there in the silence, he heard something behind him, soft, almost imperceptible. A faint shuffle of footsteps, followed by a low creak from inside the house. John's blood ran cold. He spun around, his heart racing, but there was no one there. The house loomed behind him, its windows dark and empty. He stepped back inside, slamming the door shut behind him, his breath coming in short gasps. He looked around the room, his mind reeling. The house felt different now, foreign, unfamiliar. The air was thick, and the oppressive stillness had returned. But this time, it was far worse. Something was inside. Something had entered while he was distracted. He heard another knock, this time from somewhere deeper in the house. A slow, deliberate tap, a single knock echoing through the empty halls. The voice from the phone returned in his mind, clearer now than ever before. "Don't open the door." But it was too late. Something was already inside, and it was waiting for him. John stood in the center of the living room, his hands trembling, his mind racing. The house was unnervingly quiet, as if it had been waiting for him to make the wrong move. The knocking had stopped, but the echo still lingered in his mind. He didn't know what to do. Everything inside him screamed to stay away from the door, to lock himself in the house and never open it again. But another part of him, a part he hated for even existing, pushed him to open it, to look, to see for himself what was out there. He glanced toward the door once more, the wooden surface looking so innocent, so plain. Yet, in that moment it seemed as though it were the only thing that mattered. The door, and whatever waited behind it. His thoughts turned to the voice that had warned him so insistently, the voice that was his own, but not his. He could still hear its strange, distorted tone in his ears, its words repeating like a haunting mantra. Don't open the door. But why? Why warn him and then leave? Why would someone call him from his own number, say those chilling words, and then simply hang up? It didn't make sense. Nothing about this made sense. John paced the room, trying to shake off the feeling that had settled in his chest. He needed to think, to clear his head. The door wasn't going anywhere. It was just a door, after all. He could open it or not open it. Whatever happened would happen. He couldn't live his life in fear. His fingers brushed against the back of the couch as he walked, his mind still tangled in a mess of conflicting thoughts. The phone call had been strange, yes, but there had to be an explanation. Maybe it was some kind of prank. Maybe it was some random telemarketer or a glitch in the phone system. He had no way of knowing for sure, but what he did know was that no matter how terrified he felt, he couldn't let his fear control him. He needed to find out who was outside. Turning toward the door, he approached it slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. Each step felt heavier, as if the floor beneath him were growing more and more unstable with every passing second. The silence in the house was deafening, and the longer he stood there, the more his nerves seemed to stretch thin, like a taut wire on the verge of snapping. He reached out, his hand hovering over the doorknob. The cool metal seemed to mock him, daring him to turn it. But the voice, the warning, the knocks, they all returned to him with a rush of urgency. Don't open the door. John hesitated. Maybe this was a mistake. Maybe he should just leave it alone, call the police, and let someone else deal with it. But the thought of being locked in his own home, trapped by his own fear, seemed even worse than facing whatever awaited him outside. With a deep breath, he twisted the doorknob and pulled the door open, just enough to peek through. The darkness outside seemed endless. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, and the wind rustled the trees with an unsettling noise that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. There was no sign of movement, no figures lurking in the shadows. But then again, who could tell in the darkness? The porch was barely illuminated by the dim street lights, their light casting long, stretched shadows that danced and swayed with every gust of wind. He took a step forward, his eyes scanning the surroundings. But there was nothing but the hollow emptiness of the night. Suddenly, he heard it again, a sound from inside the house, a soft creak followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. John's breath caught in his throat as his head whipped back toward the interior of the house. The door had been closed when he'd stepped outside. He was sure of it. Yet somehow, there was someone else in the house. He could hear them. Whoever it was, they were walking in the hallway, moving slowly, deliberately, as though trying to be as quiet as possible. His heart raced. Panic rose in his chest as he stepped back inside, slamming the door shut behind him. The sound of footsteps grew louder, coming from the direction of the living room. His body moved on its own accord, pushing him toward the stairs. wasn't imagining it. There was someone in the house. "Hello?" John's voice cracked as he called out into the darkness, his eyes wide with fear. The silence answered him, but it was the wrong kind of silence. The kind that spoke of waiting. Waiting for something to happen. For someone to make a sound. For someone to do something. Anything. John didn't move for a long time. His muscles locked in place, as though if he stood perfectly still, whatever it was that was waiting for him might just leave. But the steps continued, slow and deliberate, until they stopped altogether. For a long, agonizing moment, there was nothing. Then came a soft, unsettling whisper. It sounded like a breath against his ear. He spun around, but there was no one there. His thoughts raced. The house seemed so much larger now, its shadows deepening and growing darker with every second. He could hear every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind, as though the house itself was alive and watching him. John's hand reached for the nearest lamp, flicking the switch, but the light flickered before settling into a dim, sickly yellow. The shadows in the room seemed to grow, stretching like fingers reaching out to claim him. His breathing was rapid, shallow, as he stumbled toward the stairs. But he stopped before he reached the top. The air grew heavy again, and the sensation of being watched intensified, making the hairs on his arms stand at attention. The voice on the phone echoed in his mind. "Don't open the door." What door? He was inside. The door had been opened, yes, but now he was here, inside, away from it, safe. Or so he thought. Another sound, this time a light tap on the window. John froze. He turned slowly, his eyes narrowing as they focused on the window at the far end of the room. The shadows obscured the outside, but he knew what he had heard. A knock. Someone or something was outside. The tap came again, softer this time, as if whoever or whatever was out. There was testing him, waiting to see how he would respond. Then it came again, louder. 3 knocks, one after the other. John's pulse quickened. The knocking continued, each sound more insistent than the last. His mind raced. Should he call the police? Should he hide? He wasn't sure, but he knew one thing for certain. This was no random knock. This was no accident. The phone call, the voice, the knocks. He wasn't alone. Not anymore. As he stood there, paralyzed by fear, he realized something terrible. The person, or whatever it was, outside wasn't just knocking to get in. They were knocking to tell him something. They were knocking to warn him. The knocks persisted, each one resonating through the house, seeming to reverberate off the walls and into John's very bones. His mind spun in chaotic circles as he stood frozen in the center of the living room, staring at the window, his body refusing to move. The house, once a sanctuary, now felt like a prison, a cage he couldn't escape from. His heart raced in his chest, each beat a reminder of how much danger he was in, or perhaps how much danger he had invited into his home. The knocking became louder, more urgent, but still there was no sign of who or what was outside. John could hear the sound of his own shallow breathing, the erratic thumping of his heart in his ears, but nothing else. It was as if the world had narrowed down to just him and the sound of those relentless knocks. He wanted to run. He wanted to flee, but his feet felt as though they were glued to the floor, rooted by some unseen force. The voice from the phone, his own voice, continued to echo in his mind. Don't open the door. And yet, he had already opened it, and it hadn't made a difference. The knock had come from the inside, not the outside. There was no escaping this, no turning back. John felt a cold sweat on his forehead, his clothes sticking to his skin, his palms clammy against the cool surface of the lamp he was still gripping. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to grow longer, stretching as if reaching toward him, eager to claim him. The knock came again, louder than ever. 3 rapid taps, followed by a long pause. John turned, his gaze locking on the front door once more, the one he had opened moments earlier. The silence that followed the knock was even worse than the noise itself. His eyes darted from the door to the hallway and then up the stairs. What was waiting for him? A feeling of dread washed over him, as though something was approaching, something that he couldn't see yet, but could feel growing nearer with each passing second. It was like the air itself had thickened, turned oppressive, suffocating. The voice on the phone, his voice, the warning, the door. A thought began to form in his mind, a terrifying possibility that he could barely grasp. Could it be? Was it possible? He didn't have time to dwell on it. With a surge of adrenaline, John sprinted up the stairs, his feet pounding against the wooden steps, echoing through the house. He didn't stop until he reached the top, where the hallway stretched before him, dark and silent. His eyes darted left and right, scanning every shadow for movement, every corner for signs of something or someone lurking in the darkness. The sound of the knocking had stopped, but the stillness that followed was even more unnerving. He held his breath, listening for any hint of a sound, any clue to what was happening. It came, a soft, creaking noise from behind him, from the direction of the bedroom. John spun around, his heart in his throat. But again, there was nothing, just the faintest whisper of air, the sound of the house settling. His mind was playing tricks on him. It had to be. There was no one here. And then, from somewhere deep in the house, a voice. It was a whisper, barely audible, but unmistakable. John ... His stomach dropped. The voice, it wasn't just his own voice anymore. It was different. A distorted version of it, like a shadow of himself speaking from somewhere out of sight. The voice was close, so close that John could almost feel the breath on his neck. But when he spun around, the hallway remained empty. He backed away slowly, his feet crunching against the floorboards, the silence stretching around him like a thick, suffocating blanket. His breath quickened, his pulse pounding in his ears as the whispers grew louder, clearer. "John, help me." It wasn't his voice. It wasn't a distorted version of his voice either. This was something else, something foreign, something that should never have been here. John took another step back, but this time, something changed. The shadows in the hallway seemed to shift, as if they had a life of their own. They stretched toward him, thin and twisting like tendrils, wrapping around his ankles, his legs. He gasped, trying to pull his foot free, but the shadows only tightened their grip. His heart hammered in his chest, panic flooding his veins. What was happening? What was going on? The shadows seemed to rise, swallowing the light from the dim hallway, until he could see nothing but the shifting darkness around him. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, and in the distance, he could hear something else. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, moving toward him from somewhere behind the veil of shadows. John turned and ran, sprinting back toward the stairs, his mind screaming at him to get out, to escape. But as he reached the top step, something cold and clammy grabbed him by the wrist, jerking him backward. His heart stopped as he spun around. But again, there was nothing but the oppressive weight of the dark. He scrambled back down the stairs, slipping on the worn wood, his body aching with the effort of moving so quickly. But still, the dark followed. It chased him. It crawled on the walls, under the floorboards, over his skin. John reached the bottom of the stairs and ran toward the front door, his hand fumbling for the doorknob. It wouldn't turn. It wouldn't open. He yanked at it, tugging with all his strength, but the door stayed shut, locked by some invisible force. His breath came in ragged gasps as he turned in desperation, searching for an escape. The knocking began again, louder, more frantic. John looked toward the window. The curtains were drawn, but in the reflection of the glass, he saw a figure standing just beyond the door. A tall, dark shape silhouetted against the faint glow of the streetlight outside. The figure didn't move. It simply stood there, watching, waiting, and then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. The knocking stopped. For a moment there was only silence, and then a voice so close now, it seemed to be inside his own head. "Let me in." John's blood ran cold as the words wrapped around his mind, squeezing, suffocating. He stumbled back, the walls of the room closing in on him, the shadows swallowing everything in their path. There was no escape. There was no way out. The door opened. He didn't hear it. He didn't see it. But it was open now, the way clear for whatever it was that stood beyond. And John knew in that moment that he had made a terrible mistake. There was no more warning, no more time. He stepped forward toward the door, unable to stop himself. And as he crossed the threshold, he felt a cold hand close around his wrist, pulling him into the darkness, pulling him into the very place from which he had tried to escape. The door slammed shut behind him, and everything went dark.